Hello and welcome to the Chemistry Academy. In this video we're going to go over naming compounds, which is applicable to National 4 and National 5 chemistry. So we're going to start off with talking about naming compounds if we just know what elements are in them, and then we'll move on to naming the compounds if we're given actual chemical formula like these things here. So things you need to bear in mind when it comes to naming compounds is the name endings and then also these prefixes here. So the name endings depend on what is actually in your compound. So if you have only two elements in your compound, the end of the name will be IDE or IDE. The rest of the name comes from basically combining the names of the two elements that are in it. We'll look at some examples in a second that should hopefully help that make sense. Then if you have two elements plus oxygen as a third element, your compound can either end in ite or ate. Ate is where there's more oxygen than when it's an ite. You won't need to necessarily know or remember when it's an ate or when it's an ite. If there is ever an instance you need to double check, you will be able to just look up in your data booklet on page 8. So anything that ends in ate you will find on page 8 of your data booklet. And then on that page you can check to see whether the substance, depending on what information you're given, is ite or ate. If you're not given enough information to be able to decide between the two, then you should really be able to put down either, but ate is more common than ite. So if we look at some examples to get us going, and we'll come to the prefixes after. If we've got a compound then that contains sodium and chlorine, that's two elements, which means our name of our compound is going to end in ide, and the rest of the name is just a mixture of the two elements' names. So sodium keeps its own name, it doesn't change. So sodium, and then the chlorine, instead of being ene at the end, it becomes ide. So our compound would be called sodium chloride. Oh. Spelling's not great this morning. Okay, so that's our first example. If we had lithium and chlorine in a compound, our compound would be lithium chloride. If we had magnesium and chlorine, it would be magnesium chloride. Okay, so you're just adding the elements together and the end becomes ide. For a second example, we've got copper, carbon and oxygen. So here we've got two elements plus oxygen, which means it's going to end in ite or ate. We're going to go with 8 because it is the most common one, and the two elements that aren't oxygen, their names are used to make up the beginning of the compound name. So copper stays as copper. You tend to find the metal always keeps its own name, and then the carbon, instead of being carbon, becomes carbon-8. Okay, so we can tell from this name that there's copper, carbon, and because of the 8 ending, there's oxygen there as well. So the oxygen's not included in the name as oxy or anything, it's represented as being in the compound with the use of the 8. Okay, so copper, carbonate. If we had magnesium, carbon and oxygen, then it'd be magnesium carbonate. If it was magnesium, nitrogen and oxygen, it would be magnesium nitrate. Okay, so the two elements that aren't oxygen, their names are used to make up the majority of the compound name, and then you just adapt the name ending to be 8 usually, or in some cases it can be ite. For example 3, a compound with potassium and bromine, so that's two elements only, which means it's going to end in ide, so it would be potassium bromide. Okay, so hopefully you can start to see the pattern here and how the names of the chemicals are made up based on what elements are in them. Here we've got aluminium and sulfur. So again, that's only two elements, which means that our compound name is going to end in ide. So this will then be aluminium sulfide. Okay, so the end of the sulfur gets dropped and you replace it with ide. If we had a compound with aluminium, sulfur and oxygen, which we've got down the bottom here, then it would be aluminium sulfate. Or it could be aluminium sulfite, depending on how many oxygens are in it. But like I said, you may, in some instances, we do have an example over here where we've got a sulfite. But if you're just told the elements in the compound and nothing else, then I would just always go with the sulfate because that is the most common one. Okay, so that's some examples of naming compounds. Hopefully from that you've got an idea of how the names go together just from knowing what elements are in them. But if we go over now to naming them from the chemical formula, which is probably the skill you most need to use in National 5 chemistry, and this skill here is more to do with National 4 level really. But when it comes to naming them from the chemical formula, we quite often need to use the prefixes as well. The prefixes are added into the name when we know how many atoms of different elements there are. So the first example I've picked here is the one that people always know the name of this chemical anyway, but without necessarily realising how it relates to these naming rules. So we've got a compound with carbon and oxygen. That means that it would end in "ide" because that's only two elements. We've got carbon as a C, and then oxygen, so it could be called carbon oxide because it's carbon and oxygen, but because we know there's two oxygens, we can put in a prefix to tell the person that there's two oxygens. So this molecule or this compound is called carbon dioxide, which I'm sure you've all heard of plenty of times before. And the reason it's dioxide is because there's two oxygens in one molecule and in one carbon. Okay. If we move to this one here, we've got phosphorus and hydrogen, which means this could be called hydrogen phosphide. But because we know there's three hydrogens, we would call it trihydrogen phosphide because there's three hydrogens. So trihydrogen phosphide. There's only one phosphorus, which is why we just don't put a prefix. We could put trihydrogen monophosphide, but that's rare that we ever do that. Same with this carbon dioxide. We could call it monocarbon dioxide, but it doesn't ever really get called that. Most of the time, if there's only one of something, we just don't put a prefix. If we then go to this molecule, or this compound here, this is H2O. We all know this is being called water, but that's not water's chemical name. It's hydrogen oxide because it's hydrogen and oxygen, and there's two hydrogens, which means it can be called dihydrogen oxide. So there's two hydrogens, which is why we put the di. There's only one oxygen, so we just have no prefix and have it as oxide. Here we've got S, which is sulfur, O, which is oxygen. So this would be sulfur oxide, but because we know there's two oxygens, we would put a di in front of the oxide, so we would call this sulfur dioxide. Number 5, Si, that's silicon. Again with oxygen, so it's silicon oxide, but we know there's two oxygens, so we would call it silicon dioxide. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here. Here we've got sodium, nitrogen and oxygen. So that's three different elements, two elements including oxygen, which tells us it's probably going to end in ite or ate. To double check, we look at page 8 of our data booklet, and you should find a table that has ions on it. So a table that looks a bit like this. You can see it. So if we look for something with nitrogen and oxygen, or this NO3 group, we should be able to find that in that table it tells us nitrate is NO3 minus. So the charge isn't shown here, but we know from this, looking at page 8 of our data booklet, the NO3 is nitrate. Because it's with sodium, this would then be called sodium nitrate. Okay. This nitrate is classed as a group ion, so we don't call it a nitrogen trioxide. We know as chemists that if something's called a nitrate, we know that's NO3. Okay, so any compounds that have more than two elements in them, you tend to not have the prefixes in when it comes to the non-metal element groups. It's just given a collective group name. This example here, example 7, magnesium, we've got sulfur and oxygen, so that's again 2 elements plus oxygen. So if we look up our page 8, we should be able to find that SO4 is sulfate. So this would be called magnesium sulfate. Okay. Then here we've got nitrogen and oxygen. So this is a 2-element compound, which means it's going to end in "ide". It's got 2 nitrogens, so that's going to be dinitrogen. And it's got 4 oxygens. Prefix for 4 is tetra. So it'll be dinitrogen tetraoxide. Okay, so that's the one where we've got more than one of each of the atoms, so we have 2 prefixes in the name. This one here, we've got sodium, sulfur and oxygen, so that's 2 elements plus oxygen, which means it's either going to end in "ate" or "ite". So if we look up the page 8 of the data booklet, you'll find that SO3 is sulfite. So this is going to end in sulfite this time. So this is our example of an "ite". You can see that the sulfite has 1 less oxygen than the sulfate, which matches what I said before about if there's less oxygen than when it's an 8, it's called "ite". Here we've got sodium, and we've got 2 sodiums, so we can call it disodium sulfite, or you could just call it sodium sulfite. It's most often called sodium sulfite just because as chemists we would know how to work out how many sodium ions there are for every sulfite ion, but that's something we can do in another video where we look at chemical formula. And then our last example here, we've got aluminium, oxygen and hydrogen. So again, that's 2 elements plus oxygen, so we would need to look at page 8. And if we look at page 8, we would find that the OH is hydroxide. There's 3 of them, so we could call it trihydroxide. And then the beginning of the name would be the aluminium. So aluminium trihydroxide could be the name for this one, or quite often it would just be called aluminium hydroxide. And like I said, as a chemist with your knowledge of chemical formulae, you'd be able to work out what the ratio of those ions are in order to know that there were 3 hydroxide ions. Okay, so things you would really need to be able to know is from the name what elements are in it, so the opposite of what we've kind of done here with naming it from knowing the elements in it. And then also you could be asked to write a formula from knowing the name with prefixes. So again, just the opposite to what we've done here. Just remember, any thing that ends in 8 you'll find on page 8, and if there are compounds with more than 2 elements in it, you will usually have what we call a group ion, and you will find that on page 8 on that table at the top. So I hope that helps you with your naming of compounds for National 5 and National 4 Chemistry. If you find this helpful, please give it a like, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.